March 3, 1943, 10:00 a.m., the Bismarck Sea, 15 minutes. That's how long it took to destroy 8 Japanese transports, sink 4 destroyers, and kill nearly 7,000 soldiers who never fired a single shot. 15 minutes to shatter an empire's belief that it ruled the Pacific. But here's what the history books won't tell you. The weapon that caused this massacre wasn't designed in Washington. It wasn't approved by any general. It was built in secret by a 50-year-old mechanic from Texas named Paul Irving Gunn, a civilian, a man they called Pappy because he was too old to be taken seriously. A man who walked into a hangar one night with a blowtorch and an idea so insane that the United States Army told him to forget it. He didn't forget. He built it anyway. And on that March morning, Japanese admirals who had conquered half the Pacific watched their entire fleet get sawed apart by a weapon they didn't even know existed. This is how one stubborn old man changed the war. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. The Japanese Navy has just executed the most devastating surprise attack in military history. 4 battleships sunk. 2,000 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet crippled in 90 minutes. For the next 6 months, Japan swept through Asia like nothing could stop it. Singapore fell in February. The Dutch East Indies in March. The Philippines in May. By summer 1942, the rising sun flag flew over an empire stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. Japanese convoy commanders grew arrogant. They had reason to be. In 14 months of war, American bombers had failed to sink a single major warship in open ocean. Not one. The numbers were pathetic. B-17 flying fortresses dropped bombs from 20,000 feet and missed by hundreds of meters. Accuracy against moving ships was less than 1%. Japanese sailors learned to watch the bombers pass overhead and laugh. They called them flying noisemakers, loud, harmless, a joke. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received monthly reports confirming what everyone already knew. American air power posed no threat to Japanese shipping. The doctrine was simple. Keep the anti-aircraft guns pointed at the sky. The bombers stay high to avoid the flak. Their bombs fall into empty water. Convoy continues. War continues. Japan wins. Meanwhile, in New Guinea, Australian and American soldiers were dying in the jungle, starving, running out of ammunition. Every Japanese convoy that got through meant more enemy reinforcements, more suffering, more death. The Allied command tried everything. Low-level torpedo attacks, skip bombing experiments, different altitudes, different angles. Nothing worked. The convoys kept coming. The body count kept rising. And no one in Washington had any idea how to stop it. Paul Irving Gunn was not supposed to be in this war. He was 50 years old. A civilian pilot who had spent 2 decades flying mail routes and fixing broken engines across the Pacific. Born in Arkansas, raised in Texas, Pappy had the kind of mechanical intuition that couldn't be taught in any school. He could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. He could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. Machines spoke to him in a language that most people never learned to hear. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941, Pappy was running an airline in Manila. Every other American civilian evacuated. Pappy refused to leave. He loved the Philippines. He had built a life there. He wasn't about to abandon it to the enemy. So he joined the Army Air Forces as a captain and started flying combat missions in whatever aircraft the military could spare. He flew P-40 fighters with patched bullet holes. He flew B-17s with engines held together by wire and prayer. He saw the same failure everyone else saw. Bombs dropping into empty ocean. Japanese ships sailing on untouched. Young pilots dying for nothing. But where everyone else saw an unsolvable problem, Pappy saw something different. He saw a machine that wasn't being used correctly. The idea came to him in February 1942. He had just returned from another failed mission. Another convoy that escaped. Another report that would read, "No hits observed." Pappy sat in the hangar staring at a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber and asked himself a question that no one else was asking. Why are we treating this like a bomber? The B-25 was designed to carry bombs and drop them from altitude. It had a bombardier in the nose who looked through a glass window and tried to calculate where the bombs would land. The problem was obvious. You can't hit a moving ship from 15,000 feet. The math doesn't work. The wind changes. The ship turns. The bombs fall where the ship was not where the ship is. So Pappy asked the next question. What if we don't drop bombs from altitude? What if we fly straight at the ship at 50 feet and pour machine gun fire into the deck until every anti-aircraft gunner is dead? Then drop a bomb that skips across the water and hits the hull at waterline. The bombardier position was useless for this. You don't need a glass window when you're flying at wave height. You need guns. Pappy did the calculations. He could remove the bombardier seat and replace it with 8 50 caliber machine guns, all forward firing, all synchronized. 8 streams of armor-piercing rounds converging on a single point. The firepower of a small destroyer concentrated in the nose of an aircraft. He brought the idea to his commanding officer. The response was immediate. Rejected. The structural engineers said the recoil from 8 guns would tear the airframe apart. The tactics experts said flying at 50 feet against anti-aircraft fire was suicide. The procurement officers said modifying aircraft without authorization was a court-martial offense. One colonel looked at Pappy's diagrams and laughed out loud. This belongs in a science fiction magazine, he said, not a war plan. The official rejection came within a week. Request denied. Concept impractical. Proposal archived. Do not pursue. Pappy nodded politely, said yes sir, walked out of the office, and started building it anyway. The workshops of Brisbane became Pappy's secret laboratory. He worked at night when the inspectors weren't watching. He scrounged parts from aircraft too damaged to fly. He borrowed welding equipment from Australian mechanics who thought he was crazy, but respected his determination. The first modification took 3 weeks of 18-hour days. Pappy cut out the bombardier's glass nose and replaced it with steel plating. He welded gun mounts into the new nose. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Combined rate of fire, 6,400 rounds per minute. He rigged the ammunition feeds himself because no one had ever designed a system for this configuration. He recalculated the weight distribution because adding 8 guns and 4,000 rounds of ammunition changed everything about how the aircraft handled. When he finished, the B-25 didn't look like a bomber anymore. It looked like a predator. The nose was solid metal bristling with gun barrels. The profile was aggressive, angry, completely unlike anything flying in any air force in the world. The other mechanics called it Pappy's folly. They were certain it would fail. The first test flight was scheduled for a remote airfield in Australia. No observers, no paperwork, no permission. Pappy climbed into the cockpit himself. He had never test-flown an aircraft this heavily modified. He had no idea if it would even get off the ground. The engines roared. The aircraft rolled down the runway. It lifted off. It flew. Pappy turned toward the target range where old boats had been anchored for bombing practice. He dropped to 100 feet, then 50. The waves rushed past below him close enough to touch. He lined up on the first target. His finger found the trigger. 8 guns fired simultaneously. The sound was deafening. The nose of the aircraft lit up like a welding torch. Tracers streamed toward the target boat in a solid wall of destruction. The boat disintegrated. Wood splintered. Metal tore. In 5 seconds, Pappy fired 400 rounds. Every single one hit the target area. The recoil slowed the aircraft exactly as the engineers had predicted. It didn't matter. The aircraft held together. The guns worked. And the target was destroyed in a way that bombs from 20,000 feet could never accomplish. Pappy made 3 more passes. 3 more targets destroyed. When he landed and showed the gun camera footage to Major General George Kenney, the commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenny watched in silence. Then he said 4 words that changed everything. "Build me more of these." January 1943, New Guinea. The first combat test came against Japanese shipping near Lae. 4 modified B-25s against a small convoy. The pilots had trained for weeks in Pappy's new tactics. Approach at wave height. Stay below the anti-aircraft guns. Open fire at 800 yards. Keep firing until you're on top of them. Drop the skip bomb. Pull up. Get out. The Japanese didn't know what hit them. Their gunners were trained to track aircraft in the sky. These aircraft weren't in the sky. They were on the water. Coming straight at them. Guns blazing. The anti-aircraft crews died at their stations. The skip bombs hit the waterline. 2 transports sank in 90 seconds. The survivors who reached Rabaul described something impossible. Aircraft that flew like speedboats. Guns that fired like machine gun nests. A weapon that shouldn't exist. Japanese intelligence dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Panicked sailors seeing things that weren't there. The doctrine was clear. Bombers cannot attack at wave height. Therefore, these bombers did not attack at wave height. Therefore, the survivors must be mistaken. They were not mistaken. And in 6 weeks, the largest convoy Japan had assembled in months would sail directly into the trap that Pappy Gunn had built. Late February 1943, Rabaul Harbor. Admiral Masatomi Kimura watched his convoy assemble with quiet pride. 8 transports carrying 6,900 soldiers of the 51st Division. 8 destroyers providing escort. Over 100 anti-aircraft guns ready to fill the sky with steel. This was the reinforcement that would turn the tide in New Guinea. This was the convoy that would prove Japan still controlled the Pacific. Kimura had studied every American air attack of the past year. He knew their patterns. He knew their weaknesses. He knew his umbrella of steel would protect his ships the same way it always had. The Americans were predictable. They came from high altitude. They dropped bombs that missed. They flew home in defeat. It had happened dozens of times. It would happen again. On March 1st, the convoy departed Rabaul, sailing south toward Lae. The sea was calm. The weather was favorable. Every ship maintained perfect formation. Every officer followed doctrine exactly as written. Admiral Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship and allowed himself to feel confident. In 48 hours, his soldiers would reach New Guinea. The Americans could send every bomber they had. It wouldn't matter. What Kimura did not know was that in the hangars of Port Moresby, 13 modified B-25s were being loaded with ammunition and skip bombs. What he did not know was that pilots were studying photographs of his convoy and memorizing attack angles. What he did not know was that a 50-year-old mechanic from Texas had just rendered every lesson he ever learned about naval warfare completely obsolete. The Japanese called their anti-aircraft strategy the umbrella of steel. 100 guns pointed at the sky, overlapping fields of fire. Any aircraft that entered the kill zone would face a wall of exploding shells. It had worked for 14 months. It was about to fail in 15 minutes. In Part 2, we will be there when the first B-25s appear on the horizon. We will watch Admiral Kimura's confidence turn to confusion, then to horror. We will see Japanese sailors die at their guns because they were pointing in the wrong direction. And we will witness the 15 minutes that convinced Tokyo the war was already lost. Pappy Gunn built the weapon. Now it was time to use it. Pappy Gunn had done the impossible. He had turned a medium bomber into a flying gunship. He had proven it worked. He had destroyed targets in ways that no aircraft had ever destroyed targets before. But none of that mattered. Because in February 1943, the United States Army Air Forces still refused to authorize mass production of his modification. The brass had seen the test footage. They had read the reports. They had watched a 50-year-old mechanic accomplish what their entire engineering corps said couldn't be done. And their response was to bury it in paperwork. 23 modified B-25s existed. 23 aircraft that could change the war. And they were sitting in hangars collecting dust, while Japanese convoys delivered thousands of reinforcements to New Guinea every month. The kill ratio for conventional bombing remained below 1%. American pilots kept dying in attacks that accomplished nothing. And the men who could authorize Pappy's weapon kept finding reasons to say no. This is where the real fight began. Not against the Japanese, against the United States military itself. Colonel Howard Knox commanded the Procurement Division for the Southwest Pacific Theater. He was 54 years old, career military, and absolutely convinced that Paul Gunn was a dangerous amateur who would get pilots killed. Knox had spent 30 years learning how aircraft were supposed to work. He had written manuals on proper bombing technique. He had trained hundreds of crews in the doctrine that kept them alive. And now some civilian mechanic was telling him that everything he knew was wrong. Knox called a meeting in Brisbane on February 8, 1943. Pappy Gunn was ordered to attend. So was Major General George Kenney, who had championed the modification project. So were 6 other senior officers who would decide whether the gunship program lived or died. Knox opened the meeting by reading from the official rejection letter. This modification violates 17 separate safety regulations, he said. The structural stress exceeds design parameters. The ammunition load creates unacceptable fire hazard. The proposed tactics require flying below minimum safe altitude. He looked directly at Pappy. Captain Gunn, do you understand that you are asking me to authorize a weapon that will kill American pilots? Pappy stood up. Colonel, American pilots are already dying. They're dying because we're sending them to drop bombs that don't hit anything. I'm asking you to give them a weapon that works. Knox shook his head. The regulations exist for a reason. We cannot simply ignore them because one mechanic had a lucky test flight. The aircraft is not designed for this configuration. How long before the airframes start failing? How long before the guns jam in combat? How long before we start losing crews to mechanical failure instead of enemy fire? Pappy pulled out a folder. He had anticipated this argument. He had documentation for every modification he had made. Stress calculations, failure point analyses, maintenance records from the test aircraft showing 0 mechanical problems across 47 flights. I've flown these aircraft myself, Pappy said. I've put more hours on the modified B-25s than anyone alive. The airframes are holding, the guns are functioning. The only thing failing is our willingness to use them. Knox wasn't convinced. Regulations exist because men smarter than you wrote them based on hard experience. You want me to throw all that away because you welded some guns into a bomber nose. The meeting ended without a decision. Knox promised to review the documentation. Everyone knew what that meant. More delays, more paperwork, more Japanese convoys reaching their destinations while the weapon that could stop them gathered dust. Pappy walked out of that meeting knowing that he needed help. He couldn't fight the bureaucracy alone. He needed someone with enough rank and enough influence to force the issue. He found that person 3 days later. Major General George Kenney had been watching the procurement battle with growing frustration. He was the commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. He had seen Pappy's demonstration personally. He knew the gunship worked. And he was running out of patience with colonels who cared more about regulations than results. Kenney called Pappy into his office on February 11th. I'm going to give you one chance, Kenney said. One official demonstration in front of every officer who matters. If it works, I'll have the authority to bypass Knox and order full production. If it fails, you're finished. Court-martial for unauthorized modification of military aircraft. Career over. Pappy didn't hesitate. When do we do it? Kenney looked at his calendar. February 15th. That gives you 4 days to prepare the best demonstration this theater has ever seen. You need to prove not just that the weapon works, but that it works better than anything else we have. I want side-by-side comparison. Conventional bombing versus your gunship. Same targets. Same conditions. Undeniable results. 4 days. Pappy had 4 days to prepare a demonstration that would either save his program or end his military career. He had 4 days to prove that everything the United States Army Air Forces believed about aerial warfare was about to become obsolete. He had 4 days to change history. February 15, 1943. 0600 hours. Charters, Towers Airfield, Queensland, Australia. The morning air was thick with humidity. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but hadn't reached the test range yet. Pappy Gunn stood on the tarmac watching officers arrive from across the theater. Colonels, generals, admirals from the Navy Liaison Office, intelligence officers who would report directly to Washington. Everyone who mattered was here to watch either a triumph or a disaster. The target range had been prepared with captured Japanese vessels. 3 small patrol boats anchored in a line, each one representing the kind of target that conventional bombing had failed to destroy for 14 months. The first test would use standard tactics. A flight of 3 B-25s would approach at medium altitude and attempt conventional horizontal bombing. The second test would use Pappy's modified gunships approaching at wave height. Same targets, same aircraft type, different configuration. Colonel Knox stood near the observation tower with his arms crossed. He had brought his own staff to document what he expected to be a catastrophic failure. If Pappy's aircraft crashed or malfunctioned, Knox would have everything he needed to shut down the program permanently. 0700 hours. The conventional bombers took off first. They climbed to 8,000 feet and approached the target vessels in standard formation. The bombardiers calculated wind speed. They adjusted for drift. They released their bombs at the optimal moment according to every manual the Army had ever written. The bombs fell. They missed, not by a little, by hundreds of feet. The first aircraft's payload landed in empty water, 200 yards from the nearest target. The second aircraft scored no hits. The third aircraft's bombs fell so far off target that the spotters initially couldn't locate the impact points. Knox said nothing. This was expected. This was why bombing ships was considered nearly impossible. This was why his regulations made sense. 0730 hours. Pappy's turn. 3 modified B-25s taxied onto the runway. The nose of each aircraft bristled with 850 caliber machine guns. The crews had trained for weeks in the new tactics. They knew exactly what they needed to do. Pappy was flying the lead aircraft himself. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared. The aircraft lifted off and immediately dropped to 100 feet. The other 2 gunships followed in tight formation. They approached the target range from the south, skimming so low that their propellers kicked up spray from the waves. The officers at the observation tower leaned forward. They had never seen bombers fly this low. It looked suicidal. It looked impossible. At 800 yards from the first target, Pappy opened fire. The sound was unlike anything the observers had ever heard. 8 guns firing simultaneously created a continuous roar that echoed across the water. Tracers streamed toward the target vessel in a solid wall of destruction. The patrol boat's deck erupted in splinters and flame. Pappy held the trigger for 6 seconds. In those 6 seconds, he fired nearly 500 rounds. Every round hit the target area. The vessel was torn apart from stem to stern. As he passed over the wreckage, Pappy released a 500-pound skip bomb. It bounced once across the water and slammed into the hull at the waterline. The explosion lifted the vessel out of the water. When it came back down, it was breaking in half. The second gunship attacked the second target. Same approach, same devastating result. The third gunship destroyed the third target with identical precision. 0738 hours. 8 minutes after takeoff, all 3 targets were sinking. The conventional bombers had scored 0 hits from 8,000 feet. The gunships had scored 100% hits from 50 feet. The observers stood in stunned silence. Colonel Knox's documentation team had stopped writing. There was nothing to write. The evidence was floating in pieces across the target range. General Kenny turned to Knox. "Still want to talk about regulations?" Knox didn't answer. He couldn't. He had just watched everything he believed about aerial warfare get blown apart in 8 minutes. The authorization came through on February 17th, full production of modified B-25 gunships, priority allocation of 50 caliber ammunition, training programs for every bomber crew in the Southwest Pacific. Pappy Gunn had won. But winning the bureaucratic battle was only the beginning. Now the weapon had to be deployed, and deploying it meant convincing pilots who had survived by flying high to suddenly fly at wave height into enemy guns. The resistance was immediate. Experienced crews refused to believe that flying at 50 feet was survivable. They had been trained their entire careers to stay above the anti-aircraft fire. Now, some mechanic was telling them to fly directly into it. Pappy had to demonstrate personally. He flew to forward airfields across New Guinea and Australia. He took skeptical pilots up as co-pilots and showed them exactly how the tactic worked. He explained that the anti-aircraft guns couldn't track targets moving that fast at that altitude. He explained that the gunship's firepower would suppress the deck guns before they could aim. He explained that the old way was getting pilots killed, while the new way would keep them alive. Some pilots believed him immediately. Others needed to see combat results. The first real test came on February 22nd, when 4 gunships attacked a Japanese supply convoy near Wewak. The attack lasted 90 seconds. 2 transports sunk, 1 destroyer damaged. 0 American aircraft lost. The pilots who flew that mission became instant converts. They told other pilots. Word spread through the squadrons. Within a week, every B-25 crew in the theater was requesting modification. The Japanese were completely unprepared. Their anti-aircraft doctrine assumed bombers would attack from altitude. Their guns were designed to track slow-moving targets in the sky. When the gunships came in at wave height, the Japanese crews couldn't adjust fast enough. By the time they lowered their guns, the attack was already over. Intelligence reports from intercepted Japanese communications showed confusion bordering on panic. The Americans have new weapons. One message read, "Aircraft that fly on the water. Guns that fire like machine guns. Our defenses are useless." Japanese commanders requested information about this new American aircraft. Tokyo had no answers. The modified B-25 didn't exist in any intelligence file. It wasn't supposed to exist at all. By late February 1943, Pappy Gunn's gunship had transformed from a rejected experiment into the most effective anti-shipping weapon in the Pacific theater. 47 modified B-25s were now operational. Pilot training programs were running at full capacity. Production of additional modifications was accelerating daily. The weapon worked. The military had accepted it. American pilots were finally able to hit targets that they had been missing for 14 months. But success created a new problem. Japanese intelligence had begun collecting wreckage from gunship attacks. They had recovered spent .50 caliber casings from sinking ships. They had interrogated survivors who described the attacks in terrified detail. Tokyo knew something had changed. They just didn't know what. On March 1, 1943, the largest Japanese convoy since the start of the New Guinea campaign departed from Rabaul. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, nearly 7,000 soldiers. Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded the fleet with absolute confidence. He had received intelligence briefings about possible new American tactics. He had dismissed them as exaggeration. His anti-aircraft umbrella had never failed. It would not fail now. Kimura did not know that Allied codebreakers had intercepted every message about his convoy. He did not know that reconnaissance aircraft were tracking his exact position. He did not know that every modified B-25 in the Southwest Pacific was being armed and fueled for the largest coordinated air attack of the war. And he did not know that in 48 hours, his entire fleet would be destroyed in 15 minutes by a weapon that wasn't supposed to exist. In Part 3, we will be there when the gunships arrive. We will see the attack from both sides. American pilots pressing triggers, Japanese sailors dying at their guns, and we will witness the 15 minutes that changed naval warfare forever. The weapon was ready. Now it was time to use it. A mechanic from Texas had built an impossible weapon. The United States military had rejected it. then accepted it, then deployed it across the Pacific. By March 1, 1943, 47 modified B-25 gunships were operational in the Southwest Pacific Theater. Japanese shipping losses had tripled in 6 weeks. Convoy after convoy was being torn apart by aircraft that flew at wave height and fired like machine gun nests. Tokyo knew something had changed. They just didn't understand what. And now the largest Japanese convoy since the start of the New Guinea campaign was sailing directly into the kill zone. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, nearly 7,000 soldiers who would never reach their destination. This was not a test anymore. This was not an experiment. This was the moment that would prove whether Pappy-Gun's weapon could win a war. Japanese naval intelligence had been tracking the anomalies for weeks. Their analysts in Rabaul pored over survivor reports from attacked convoys. The testimonies made no sense. Aircraft flying at 50 feet, guns firing thousands of rounds per minute, ships being torn apart before the anti-aircraft crews could aim. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka read the reports in his headquarters and dismissed them as hysteria. Panicked sailors exaggerate, he told his staff. The Americans have not invented new aircraft. They have simply gotten lucky. But the numbers told a different story. In January 1943, Japanese convoys had lost 3 ships to American air attacks. In February, the number jumped to 11. Tonnage losses increased by 400%. And the attack patterns were completely different from anything in Japanese intelligence files. Kusaka ordered a defensive review. His analysts concluded that the Americans must be using some variant of torpedo bombing. The recommended response was to increase anti-aircraft coverage and maintain altitude awareness. Point the guns at the sky. Track the bombers. Fill the air with steel. The same doctrine that had worked for 14 months. The same doctrine that was about to become obsolete. When Admiral Masatomi Kimura departed Rabaul on March 1st with his convoy of 8 transports and 8 destroyers, he carried explicit instructions from Kusaka. Maintain formation. Trust the anti-aircraft umbrella. The American air threat is manageable. Kimura believed every word. He had commanded convoy escorts for 2 years. He had never lost a ship to air attack. He had watched American bombs fall harmlessly into the ocean dozens of times. His confidence was absolute. His confidence was fatal. The first sign of trouble came on March 2nd. Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted Kimura's convoy in the Bismarck Sea. The coordinates were relayed to 5th Air Force headquarters in Port Moresby within hours. General George Kenney read the report and made a decision that would change the war. Every available aircraft would attack the convoy. Every gunship. Every bomber. Everything that could fly and fight. But the weather turned against them. Thick clouds rolled in over the Bismarck Sea. Visibility dropped to near zero. The first wave of conventional bombers attacked through the cloud cover and achieved almost nothing. Bombs fell blind. Fell. Ships escaped. The Japanese crews celebrated what they believed was another American failure. Kimura sent a message to Rabaul. Air attack repelled. Convoy proceeding on schedule. He did not know that the weather was about to clear. He did not know that Pappy-Gun was personally leading a strike force of modified B-25s that was waiting for exactly that moment. Back in Port Moresby, tensions were rising. Some officers argued that the gunships should be held back until conditions improved. Others worried that the low-level tactics would be too dangerous in marginal visibility. Pappy-Gun ignored all of them. He had waited 14 months for this opportunity. He had built a weapon specifically designed to destroy convoys like this one. He was not going to let clouds stop him. "We go at dawn," he told his pilots. "Whatever the weather does, we go at dawn." March 3, 1943. 07:30 hours. The clouds began to break. Patches of blue appeared over the Bismarck Sea. Visibility improved from 1 mile to 5, then 10, then clear horizon. The weather window had opened. 13 B-25 gunships lifted off from Port Moresby at 800 hours. Pappy Gunn flew the lead aircraft. Behind him came the most experienced gunship pilots in the theater, men who had trained for this exact mission, men who understood that the next few hours would determine whether their weapon lived or died. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 minutes. The pilots flew in loose formation at 5,000 feet, conserving fuel, checking instruments, reviewing attack plans. Each aircraft carried 8 50-caliber machine guns and 4 500-pound skip bombs. Combined firepower of the strike force exceeded 50,000 rounds. They found the convoy at 0958 hours. Kimura's ships were spread across 3 miles of ocean, maintaining the precise formation that Japanese doctrine demanded. The destroyers formed a defensive ring around the transports. Over 100 anti-aircraft guns pointed at the sky. The umbrella of steel was ready. Pappy Gunn gave the order. All aircraft descend. Attack altitude 50 feet. Weapons free on my command. The gunships dropped from 5,000 feet in a screaming dive. They leveled off at 100 feet. Then 50. The ocean rushed past below them, close enough to touch. The Japanese lookout spotted them too late. They had been watching the clouds for high-altitude bombers. They never expected aircraft to come from the waves. Pappy lined up on the destroyer Shirayuki. Range 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. Guns. 8 50-caliber machine guns fired simultaneously. The nose of the B-25 erupted in flame. Tracers streaked toward Shirayuki in a solid wall of destruction. The first rounds hit the bridge. Glass exploded inward. Officers fell where they stood. The gun crews on the forward deck were cut down before they could swing their weapons around. Pappy held the trigger for 8 seconds. 600 rounds poured into Shirayuki's superstructure. The ship's anti-aircraft guns fell silent. The deck was covered in bodies. He released his skip bombs at 400 yards. The 500-pound weapons bounced across the water. Once, twice. They slammed into Shirayuki's hull at the waterline. Twin explosions ripped the destroyer apart. The ship broke in half. The bow lifted as the stern flooded. Men jumped into burning oil. Behind Pappy, 12 more gunships attacked in rapid succession. Each pilot picked a target. Each pilot opened fire at maximum range. Each pilot watched Japanese sailors die at their guns because the guns were pointing in the wrong direction. Lieutenant John Hennebrey attacked the transport Kembu Maru. His gunfire swept the bridge and killed the helmsman. The ship began to drift. His skip bombs hit the engine room. The explosion tore a hole in the hull large enough to drive a truck through. Kembu Maru sank in 4 minutes. Captain Ed Larner hit the transport Taime Maru. His 8 guns fired for 7 seconds. The deck cargo ignited. Ammunition stored topside began cooking off. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship for 10 minutes after the attack. Major Raymond Wilkins destroyed the destroyer Tokitsukaze in a single pass. His gunfire killed the captain and executive officer. His bombs broke the keel. The ship folded in half and disappeared beneath the waves. The Japanese crews had no answer. Their anti-aircraft doctrine assumed bombers would attack from altitude. Their training assumed they would have time to track and aim. But the gunships came at 280 miles per hour from sea level. By the time the guns were lowered, the attack was over. The umbrella of steel protected nothing. It was pointing at empty sky, while death came from the waves. The attack lasted 15 minutes. 15 minutes to sink 8 transports and 4 destroyers. 15 minutes to kill nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers. 15 minutes to prove that one mechanic's impossible idea had changed naval warfare forever. When the last gunship pulled away, the Bismarck Sea was burning. Oil fires spread across miles of ocean. Wreckage floated among the dead. Admiral Kimura's flagship was crippled and drifting. His convoy was gone. His doctrine was destroyed. A Japanese officer who survived later wrote in his diary, "The sky opened and the ocean answered." We were not fighting men anymore. We were fighting the future. The news reached Tokyo within 24 hours. The Naval General Staff convened an emergency meeting. The losses were staggering. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk. Over 6,000 soldiers killed before they could reach the battlefield. An entire division erased from the order of battle. But the strategic implications were even worse. The Bismarck Sea disaster proved that Japanese convoys could no longer move safely in daylight. The anti-aircraft doctrine that had protected shipping for 14 months was now worthless. The umbrella of steel had failed completely. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the report at Combined Fleet Headquarters. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he said 5 words that would echo through Japanese military history. The Americans have outthought us. Within days, Japanese shipping patterns changed dramatically. Convoys that had sailed in daylight began moving only at night. Escorts that had formed neat defensive formations began scattering at the first sign of aircraft. Anti-aircraft crews that had pointed their guns at the sky began training for low-level attacks. Too late. The damage was done. 5th Air Force expanded gunship production immediately. By April 1943, over 100 modified B-25s were operational. By June, the number exceeded 200. Japanese shipping losses in the Southwest Pacific increased by 600%. Convoy missions that had once been routine became suicide runs. The supply lines that fed Japan's forward bases began to starve. For Pappy Gunn, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was vindication beyond anything he had imagined. The weapon he built in secret, the weapon the military rejected, the weapon that was supposed to be impossible, had just destroyed an entire fleet in 15 minutes. General Kenny recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and technical innovation that fundamentally altered the course of the Pacific War." But Pappy didn't care about medals. He was already back in the workshop improving the design, training new crews, preparing for the next battle. The war wasn't over. There were more convoys to sink, more lives to save, more impossible ideas to build. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became one of the most decisive air-naval engagements of World War II. Military historians would study it for decades. The kill ratio was unprecedented. 15 minutes of combat had destroyed a fleet that traditional bombing could never have touched. The modified B-25 gunship became the standard anti-shipping weapon for the remainder of the Pacific War. Japanese convoys never recovered. The empire that had once moved freely across the ocean was now trapped on its islands, slowly starving, watching its supply lines disappear, one ship at a time. And at the center of it all was a 50-year-old mechanic from Texas who had refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. But what happened to Paul Irving Gunn after his greatest triumph? What became of the man who changed the war? The history books record the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in detail. They record the ships sunk, the soldiers killed, the tactical revolution that followed, but they rarely mention the man who made it possible. In Part 4, we will discover the forgotten ending of this story, the price that Pappy Gunn paid for his genius, the legacy that outlived him, and the question that history has never fully answered. Why does the world remember the battle but forget the mechanic who won it? A 50-year-old mechanic from Texas had an idea that the United States military called impossible. He built it anyway, in secret workshops with scrounged parts against direct orders. His modified B-25 gunships changed everything. They destroyed the largest Japanese convoy in the Southwest Pacific in 15 minutes. They killed nearly 7,000 enemy soldiers. They proved that innovation could defeat doctrine. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became one of the most decisive engagements of World War II. But what happened to Paul Irving Gunn? The man who built the weapon. The man who flew the lead aircraft. The man who turned a rejected idea into a revolution. History remembers the battle. History forgets the mechanic. This is the final chapter of his story. And it has a twist that almost no one knows. Pappy Gunn did not survive the war. He came close. He flew over 100 combat missions in aircraft he had personally modified. He trained hundreds of pilots in tactics that he invented. He received the Distinguished Service Cross the Silver Star and multiple air medals. But on November 7, 1944, his luck ran out. Pappy was flying a transport aircraft near Leyte in the Philippines when Japanese fighters intercepted him. The aircraft was unarmed. There was nowhere to run. Pappy tried to evade diving toward the jungle canopy using every trick he had learned in 30 years of flying. It wasn't enough. The Japanese fighters shot his aircraft down over the Philippine jungle. He was 55 years old. The news reached General George Kenney the next morning. Kenney, who had championed Pappy's gunship program, who had given him the chance to prove his impossible idea, sat in silence for a long time. Then he wrote a letter to Pappy's widow. He wrote that Paul Irving Gunn had changed the course of the Pacific War. He wrote that thousands of American soldiers were alive because of weapons Pappy had built. He wrote that the military had lost one of the most innovative minds in its history. But he also wrote something else. Something that revealed a truth the military would spend decades trying to forget. Pappy Gunn was never supposed to be in combat that day. He was too valuable to risk. Kenney had ordered him to stay on the ground to focus on modifications and training to let younger pilots do the fighting. Pappy ignored the order. He couldn't stay out of the fight. The same stubbornness that had led him to build the gunship in secret had led him to fly when he should have stayed safe. The quality that made him great was the same quality that got him killed. Colonel Howard Knox, the procurement officer who had tried to shut down the gunship program, learned of Pappy's death 3 days later. Knox had spent 2 years watching his regulations get overruled by a civilian mechanic. He had opposed every modification. He had predicted disaster. And he had been wrong about everything. After the war, Knox gave a single interview about Pappy Gunn. He said 5 words that would define his legacy: "I should have listened sooner." The B-25 gunship outlived its creator by decades. After the Bismarck Sea, the modifications spread across the Pacific theater. By the end of 1943, over 300 aircraft had been converted. By 1945, the number exceeded 500. Japanese shipping losses reached catastrophic levels. Convoys that had once delivered reinforcements with impunity were being destroyed at rates that Tokyo could not sustain. The empire was strangling. The supply lines were dying. And every sinking ship traced back to a mechanic who had welded 8 guns into a bomber nose. The gunship concept did not end with World War II. In the Korean War, American pilots flew modified aircraft using tactics Pappy had pioneered. They attacked ground targets at low altitude with concentrated forward firepower. They destroyed supply convoys. They broke enemy logistics. The same principles, the same devastating results. In Vietnam, the concept evolved into something even more lethal. The AC-47 Spooky and AC-130 Spectre gunships carried the philosophy to its ultimate conclusion. Side-firing weapons, concentrated firepower, low-altitude attack profiles, aircraft that could circle a target and pour thousands of rounds per minute into a kill zone. Pilots who flew those missions studied the Bismarck Sea. They studied Pappy Gunn. They understood that they were carrying forward a revolution that had started in an Australian workshop 30 years earlier. Today, the United States Air Force operates the most advanced gunships in the world. The AC-130J Ghost Rider carries weapons that Pappy could never have imagined. Precision-guided munitions, advanced sensors, computer-controlled targeting. But the core concept remains unchanged. Concentrated firepower, low-altitude attack, overwhelming force delivered from an aircraft flying where the enemy doesn't expect. The lineage traces directly back to a 50-year-old mechanic who was told his idea was impossible. Military historians estimate that the innovations Pappy Gunn pioneered have influenced over 30,000 combat missions across 8 decades. The weapons he created and the tactics he developed have been used by air forces in more than 20 countries. His philosophy of adaptation and modification became doctrine at every major air force in the Western world. And yet his name appears in almost no textbooks. His photograph hangs in no major museum. The man who changed aerial warfare is remembered only by specialists who study the obscure corners of military history. The story of Pappy Gunn raises questions that extend far beyond one battle or one war. Why do institutions resist innovation? Why do bureaucracies reject ideas from outsiders? Why does it take catastrophe to force change? The answers are uncomfortable. Military organizations, like all large institutions, develop doctrine based on experience. They codify what worked in the past. They train people to follow established procedures. They punish deviation. This approach makes sense most of the time. Doctrine preserves knowledge. It ensures consistency. It prevents chaos. But doctrine also creates blindness. When the world changes, doctrine becomes a trap. The Japanese Navy in 1943 was not incompetent. Their officers were skilled. Their crews were disciplined. Their equipment was modern. They lost because they could not imagine that the rules had changed. They believed their anti-aircraft umbrella would work because it had always worked. They pointed their guns at the sky because the manual said that was where bombers came from. They died because no one told them the enemy had rewritten the manual. The same pattern repeats throughout military history. In World War I, cavalry officers refused to believe that machine guns had made mounted charges obsolete. Thousands of men died proving them wrong. In World War II, battleship admirals refused to believe that aircraft carriers had made surface fleets vulnerable. Pearl Harbor proved them wrong. In Vietnam, generals refused to believe that guerrilla tactics could defeat conventional forces. The jungle proved them wrong. Each time the lesson was the same. The institution that adapts survives. The institution that clings to doctrine dies. Pappy Gunn understood this instinctively. He did not have military training. He did not know the doctrine. He only knew that the current approach was failing and that he could build something better. His ignorance of the rules was his greatest advantage. He couldn't be limited by assumptions he had never learned. There is one final detail about Pappy Gunn that almost no one knows. In 1998, researchers examining declassified documents from the Southwest Pacific Theater discovered something remarkable. In December 1942, 2 months before the gunship program was officially approved, General Douglas MacArthur received a personal briefing on Pappy's modifications. MacArthur was the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Pacific. He had the authority to order any innovation he wanted. The briefing documents show that MacArthur was initially skeptical. He questioned whether a civilian mechanic could outthink his engineering corps. He doubted whether low-level attacks were survivable. But unlike other senior officers, MacArthur asked one crucial question. Has anyone actually tested this? When his staff admitted that Pappy had conducted unauthorized tests with positive results, MacArthur made a decision that changed history. He told General Kenny to give Pappy whatever he needed. He told procurement to stop blocking the program. He told everyone who had opposed the modification to get out of the way. The official approval in February 1943 was not a victory of persuasion. It was a direct order from the Supreme Commander, based on results that a mechanic had achieved by breaking the rules. Pappy never knew about MacArthur's intervention. He never knew that the highest-ranking American officer in the Pacific had personally cleared the path for his innovation. He thought he had won by proving the skeptics wrong. In reality, he had won because one general had asked the right question at the right time. Has anyone actually tested this 5 words that changed the war? Paul Irving Gunn was a 50-year-old civilian mechanic who had an idea that everyone called impossible. He was too old to be taken seriously. He had no military credentials. He had no engineering degree. He had nothing except a lifetime of working with machines and an absolute refusal to accept that problems were unsolvable. He built his weapon in secret. He tested it against orders. He proved it worked when the experts said it couldn't. And on March 3, 1943, his creation destroyed an entire Japanese convoy in 15 minutes. Nearly 7,000 enemy soldiers died that day. Thousands of American soldiers lived because those reinforcements never reached the battlefield. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a turning point in the Pacific War. The modified B-25 gunship became the most effective anti-shipping weapon of World War II. And the tactics Pappy invented are still used by air forces around the world 8 decades later. He never saw the full impact of what he created. He died 18 months after his greatest triumph, shot down over the same Philippine Islands he had refused to abandon in 1941. But his legacy survives in every gunship that flies, in every doctrine that values adaptation, in every institution that has learned to listen to the stubborn outsiders who see what the experts miss. History remembers the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It should also remember the mechanic who won it. If you know other stories of forgotten innovators who changed history, share them in the comments. The world is full of people like Pappy Gunn. People who built impossible things. People who refused to accept no for an answer. People whose names have been lost while their creations endured. This video is for them. Because the greatest innovations rarely come from the people we expect. They come from mechanics and farmers and clerks and dreamers who look at an impossible problem and say 5 simple words, "I can build something better." That is the lesson of Paul Irving Gunn. That is the lesson of the Bismarck Sea. And that is the lesson that every institution, every army, every generation must learn again. The future belongs to those who refuse to accept that the rules cannot be changed.